Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. I've talked on the subject of the histogram many times before, but I think it's important enough to return to it again. Because when we understand the histogram and what it's telling us, our image editing takes a huge leap forward. We become more confident and consistent with that image editing, and we're likely to get a darn sight quicker at it as well. It's only now that I think I've got a fairly good working relationship with the histogram that I look back to the early days of my digital photography and say to myself, if only I knew then what I know now. Here's an interesting question. How can we be on a beach in Australia on a bright sunny day with a sophisticated camera like a Canon 5D Mark IV, and yet we capture a series of shots that are flat and lacking in any sparkle? Well, it can't be that hard because I can do it pretty easily, as you can see here. So what causes this? Well, some of the reason is we're shooting raw files and they always need a fair degree of manipulation, but this scene, and many like it, really require a different exposure in different parts of the photograph. But we can't achieve that. And the closest you'll get in camera is via graduated filters perhaps, but even that is not really going to achieve what we want here. Now, as we look at this image opened in Adobe Camera Raw, we can see what the problem is as soon as we look at the histogram up at the top right. Unless we're shooting a black cat in a dark corner or a white cat in the snow, our histogram should spread from one side of the graph to the other. Ours clearly doesn't. Now, it certainly should in a photograph like this. So the histogram here is acting a little bit like what we see with our in-car satellite navigation. The histogram knows where we currently are, the position of the image now, our home point, and the histogram is actually showing us exactly where we need to go to reach our destination. And here, of course, that's an improved photograph. Now, sometimes it's not a bad idea to just hit the auto button and see what effect that has. Here you can see that it spreads that histogram. If I just click it on and off, before and after, you can see it spreading the histogram a little bit more to the left and a little bit more to the right, but not that much. So this image is lacking in contrast, color and clarity. But if we were to go to the Basic tab and to the contrast slider, if we move the contrast slider almost entirely to the right hand side, we still don't get our histogram spread right the way across from left to right. We're improving the image a little bit, but this isn't the way to do it. Well, in fact it is. Adding contrast is what we need to do, but we need to do it in another way. The histogram is simply a graph, and it shows the range of dark pixels on the left hand side, light pixels on the right hand side, and all those in between in the middle. The height of the peaks show how much of that tone we have. Now, a few moments ago I suggested that the histogram could work rather like satellite navigation in that it could point the way we needed to go. Here's how it does it. If I move my cursor up into the histogram, you can see a series of shaded areas. If I move to the left, for example, you can see that the shaded area here is blacks. See the little label just below the histogram. So this area shows us what black pixels we have in the shot, very few here. If I move to the right, we can see the area that shows the shadows. There we have the bulk of the exposure in the middle. Then we have the highlights, and we can see another deficiency here when we go to the right and the whites because we've got gaps here. Now they all nicely correspond to the sliders below. So there we have our histogram, which is showing us exactly where we're deficient in pixels and what we need to do. But instead of going down to those sliders, let's make our adjustment directly inside the histogram graph. But we'll keep our eye on the sliders as well. The histogram even gives us a visual display if we've gone too far when we move those sliders, either in blocked up shadows or highlights where there's no detail at all. Now these two boxes, the one at the top left will turn on our shadow clipping warning, and the one at the top right will turn on our highlight clipping warning. If we go too far then with any of the sliders, we'll see a visual representation of that actually on the surface of the image. It's unmistakable. So with my cursor now poised up in the top right corner, if I move to the center part where we see the word exposure just below, I could click and drag within the histogram, and you can see how I can bring that histogram nicely in the center. If I move to the right into the area that's controlling the highlights, I can click and drag and spread that out. Now we can see we must have quite a number of those highlights there because the slider's moving quite a distance and we're not seeing a massive difference to the image. So let's move to the whites and we'll click and drag in there. And now we can see it get a little bit more of a sparkle coming up as you see the white slider move to the right. We need to avoid any straight edges going up the right hand side, but we've got an image here which can take quite a bit of this slider without doing any damage. Certainly we could go somewhere to there. If I move back left into the shadows, I can do the same. I can click and drag and you can see the shadows changing a little bit, but what's going to make the most difference is the blacks here. If I click and move to the left, there you can see the effect we're having on the image. Now we've got more or less the histogram spread from left to right. Of course, I find it generally a little easier to do this work using the sliders, but it's nice sometimes to be able to just click and drag within that histogram to make our changes. Now once we've done that, there's nothing to stop us from going back and readjusting the exposure, either from directly within the histogram at the top right or via the slider, whichever you feel most comfortable with. So I could bring down that exposure just a little more. Now I've tweaked each end of the scale. I could take a little look at a little more blacks there. You can see the clipping warning up at the top right there on the left of the histogram. It's just coming on. So what it's telling us here is some of the blacks in the picture have actually been lost of all detail, but it's so minute that it's almost negligible. But if you're worried, just back away until that goes out. And you can do exactly the same with the whites. Keep going to the right, you can see that clipping warning starts to come on, so you can just back off a little bit and you're more or less happy then, or you're more or less confident that you've squeezed as much confidence and impact into this shot using that range of sliders. Now we can move on to maybe looking at a little bit of clarity, which generally gives mid-tone contrast, and we can look at vibrance too. Now sometimes when we add vibrance, to get the vibrance that I would like into the sand here, it's going to make the blue sky a little too blue for me. So what I often do here is I apply that colour using a graduated filter. So I'll double click the vibrance. We can maybe pinch a little bit of that, but I don't want to go too far because one of my pet hates is blue skies that are just not natural looking at all. So what we've just done is to use the histogram either by clicking and dragging within the histogram, where we're adjusting it and viewing it at the same time, or we adjust the settings that the histogram controls, blacks, whites, shadows, highlights and exposure, and indirectly contrast by moving the sliders, but using the histogram as a guide. So that's our global changes. It's now that we turn to changes which are going to affect just one part of the image, the strategic changes. In my case, it's the colour of the sand, and I'd probably tone down the surf where it's a little too white for me in the middle left of the picture. And of course there's a dust spot top right and a little bit of shading top left, which would need to be addressed at some stage. Now I appreciate that this image isn't a showstopper, but it is a record of my visit to this place, and I still want to get the best quality and appeal from all my images, not just the ones I consider prize winners. Now one of the ways we can do that is to use that histogram as a guide. Use the information that it's giving us to move the correct sliders the correct distance to get the maximum contrast, appeal and clarity. Now if you take a look up at the top right again now that I've added a graduated filter to the foreground to deal with that sand, and I've added an adjustment brush to tone down the worst of the highlights of the waves as they're tipping over and picking up the sunlight and becoming a little too white, I've taken them down, and I've added just a small vignette. All I've got to do when I open this up into Photoshop is to deal with that top left corner with content aware fill. But look at that histogram now. You won't get a better looking histogram for health than that. Now just before I open this up into Photoshop, I'm going to go down to the bottom right corner of my image and we'll take a look at the image we began with and the image we've ended up with, just with a little bit of help from that histogram. So the histogram is a guide. We mustn't follow it blindly, because if we are shooting a black cat in a dark corner, then the histogram is going to look rather odd, because by design most of the pixels are all going to be stacked up on the dark side. Similarly, if we're shooting a white cat in the snow, all of the histogram is going to be stacked up on the right hand side. So there's always a correlation between the histogram and the image we're viewing. We cannot look at the histogram in isolation and tell whether the image has faults or not, because it depends on the content. I'll see you next time.